Welcome, everyone. It's now 3 o'clock. Time to begin. I'm Donald Taylor, and I'm part of the team responsible for technical assistance here at the Yes Center. Welcome to today's presentation, Measuring What Matters Most, Data, Decision-Making, and the Tennessee Works Partnership, presented by Eric Carter. This webinar is a production of the Youth Employment Solutions Center and the Partners in Employment Project. The mission of the Yes Center is to improve competitive integrated employment outcomes for transition-age youth and young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The Yes Center is a joint endeavor of TASH and Transcend and is funded by the Administration on Community Living's Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. We're scheduled for an hour and a half today. Professor Carter will speak for about an hour, and then there will be dedicated time at the end for questions and answers. Just because there's dedicated time doesn't mean if when a question strikes you, you can't pose it. Professor Carter will be watching the Q&A chat alert at the bottom of the screen and will answer the questions as he sees them. I'm going to try to enable participant microphones once we get to the Q&A portion of this webinar. So if you have media on your computer, you can participate by speaking your question. But if I misunderstand the controls or you don't have a microphone on your computer, you can pose your question by typing it into the Q&A window. The Q&A window is available by rolling your mouse over the Zoom webinar window. The hidden menu in the lower portion of your screen will appear, and you can choose the Q&A button and then type your question. You can control your individual volume for the presentation using the volume controls on your local computer. Captioning is provided for this webinar. If you roll your mouse over the Zoom webinar window, the menu at the bottom will show, and you can select the closed caption button to turn it on. Also, if you're having trouble with the in-webinar captions, I've pasted a link in the chat box that you can click on to view the captions in a separate window. Today we're excited to have Eric Carter to discuss data availability and interpretation for the purpose of guiding your Partners in Employment project. Eric Carter is a professor in the Department of Special Education at Vanderbilt University and a member of the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center. He is also the principal investigator for Tennessee Works, the state of Tennessee's Partnership in Employment project. His research and teaching focuses on evidence-based strategies for supporting access to the general curriculum and promoting valued roles in school, work, and community settings for children and adults with intellectual disability, autism, and multiple disabilities. Prior to receiving his doctorate, he worked as a high school teacher and a transition specialist. He has published widely in the areas of educational and transitional services for children and youth with severe disabilities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eric Carter.
Thanks, Donald. It's good to be with everyone, especially good to be among so many states that are clearly invested in helping people with disabilities across your state to flourish in all areas of life, but particularly in the area of employment and vocation. And so it's good to be with you and good to have the opportunity to share what we've been learning now on the back end of our 5-year PI project about the ways in which data can help us make sure we're focusing in the areas that are most important to focus, making the right investments across our state, and then ultimately knowing whether or not we're making a difference in those particular areas that we've been focusing on. So what I'd really like to do is just spend time sharing the place of data and measurement and evaluation in our project, the way it's permeated all of our activities, and I'll probably slip in a few things that I wish we had done and maybe are things that you could weave into your own projects as well. So view what I'm sharing as a Tennessee story and examples of the way data can guide your work, not necessarily as exemplars for your particular state. So I think it's probably helpful before I get into the data pieces just to know a little bit about Tennessee Works and our focus. We launched the Tennessee Works Partnership in 2011. It was when we were applying for the very first round of PI grants. We were not funded in that first round, but we launched anyway, and then we're ultimately funded in the second round of that competition. So that would be 2012. And we just wrapped our funded portion of our Tennessee Works project in 2017, this past end of September. But we really conceived of Tennessee Works as really a statewide effort to ensure that every young person with disabilities in our state had the aspirations and the preparation and the opportunities and supports to access competitive integrated employment. And so in other words, what we really wanted to do is equip young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to have those aspirations towards competitive work from an early age. We wanted to make sure families knew about and were pursuing competitive work for their members with disabilities. We wanted to make sure that educators were preparing well their students for competitive employment, and that was happening all across the K-12 grade span. We wanted to make sure that our state systems then were supporting that competitive work in every corner of the state. And also for us, we wanted to make sure that our communities were really primed and positioned to see people with disabilities as indispensable to the thriving of that community and as people who had essential gifts that were needed in the workplace as well. So, those were our kind of vision initially on. In the 6 years that have passed, and our partnership has launched, we've really, I think, made a lot of strides towards those aspirations, but also sharpened our goals in some important ways. And so our 5 strategic goals, and you'll see immediately how data connects to all of these, are to align our service delivery systems and to strengthen the coordination, strengthen their coordination so that we're increasing employment opportunities for people with disabilities. And second, that we're building shared community commitment to employment first for individuals with disabilities. Third, that we're increasing the number of businesses and employers throughout the state who are actively seeking out and hiring people with disabilities. Fourth, that Tennessee would become a model public sector employer. And fifth, the 5th strategic goal is that we're preparing students in Tennessee schools for employment throughout their education and then connecting them to essential services and supports. Those you can read more about in our Expect Employment Annual Report to the Governor. And I'm going to share some links to that later on if you're wanting to see more about those. So you can definitely read more about our project in its larger context, but it is important just to understand how we're organized so you can see how we use and draw upon data. On the left side of your screen is how we visually depict the work groups that make up the Tennessee Works partnership. I won't read all of these, but if you look in each of these different areas, what you see as in the description is a clear place for data collection. How do we know for individuals and families whether we're actually raising employment expectations and aspirations? How do we know whether we're actually successful in providing resources and information and training to those individuals and families? That work group needs to have baseline data and then ongoing data to be able to evaluate those sorts of things. So I won't spend time on that, but I think these slides will be posted later as well. So decisions about policy and practice really do have to be drawing upon the very best data that's available to us. And if you look at just kind of conceptual models of variables that mark states that make the most movement in employment and integrated employment, you see that data is a really important element of that. Some of you are familiar with work by John Butterworth and their colleagues around looking at high achieving states. And one of the things that they really stress is the importance of important role of data in both communicating the importance of employment, but also in just ensuring sort of a level of accountability there as well. So for us, we've tried to embed research and data collection activities throughout all of our activities, and then making sure we're really making wise decisions about how we move forward in all of those particular areas. So one thing that we've been really trying to do in our state from the very beginning is, and I don't even know if this is a word, but trying to like de-profanitize the word data. It's a word that makes people recoil. Some of us, it excites and we our heart beats fast. But for most people, it's kind of a 4-letter word. And so we've had very early on in our project as we begin to gather to make the case for the value and the importance of data in all of our collective work. That's a really important piece. So just to kind of highlight that, here's just some quotes that are fun quotes about data that we've used and share at our partnership meetings and elsewhere. But data is important to really identifying our goal and clarifying that for our whole partnership. The Yogi Berra quote, if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. While one of his awkward quotes makes good sense. You have to have a clear sense of what you're aiming towards to really mobilize people and know whether you're making progress towards that end. We also know that good data allows us to move beyond anecdotes and opinions and really make sure that we're founding our discussions on a shared point of reference for our discussions. If we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. And that's often sort of where a lot of these discussions break down, as we're really all basing it on our own anecdotes or our own opinions. And we want to have a stronger foundation for those discussions as well. I think we all know also in our own states that, we move towards what we measure. The kinds of outcomes we document drive the things that we aim for, and what gets measured ultimately gets managed. And so we also realize that if we stated clear goals and had data to reflect on, then eventually that would drive a lot of our work at the level of our work groups and also across our state as well. And then this quote, data that is loved tends to survive, I think reminds us that we need to collect data that's actually meaningful, data that we actually use and we draw upon. Otherwise, it becomes burdensome, it becomes paperwork, it becomes process. So we need to be selective about what we collect, but then really, maybe love's a strong word, care for that data and steward it well and spend time with it as you would in any good relationship. And then this quote I also love, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And so just to make the point, as we've always made in ours, that not all data is quantitative. Some of the issues and the movements that we're wanting to be able to capture in our state are really hard to capture. And it's not all about numbers. Sometimes it's about themes and stories and other ways of depicting what we're seeing happen in each of our states. And the last quote I won't comment on, but I love it. In God we trust, all others must bring data. And we're a Bible Belt state, so that resonates with us, I guess. So what do we mean by data? From a project standpoint, we try to we really mean that in a very, very broad sense. We don't mean only quantitative data or only qualitative data in its form. We think about data as being both individual stories, but also patterns in those stories. So you can learn a lot by focusing on a few small communities or individuals and learn important things by studying those closely. But also when you start to accumulate lots and lots of stories across your state and you look for the patterns in that, that's really what research is. That's what our perspective is. And I think that way of framing it resonates a lot with our partners who say, the stories are the most powerful, and we'll say, absolutely, they just have to be part of the equation. But you learn a lot by stepping back and saying, what cuts across these stories? Anecdotes are powerful. But for those of you who have not heard me make the joke, the plural of anecdote actually is data. So lots of anecdotes make for good data. So think broadly about it. What kind of quantitative and qualitative and individual and large scale data is already in front of you, and what might you also need to collect along the way that helps you paint a better picture of where you're going, or where you are, where you might be going, and what progress you're making along the way. So what we learned very early on when we started to look at just the data already available to us as a state is that we were actually swimming in data. We had access to, we were all individually as agencies and organizations collecting our own data. And a lot of that existed, but there was really not a mechanism to share that with other agencies or organizations. And in fact, a reluctance to do so. It's a very vulnerable place for some groups to share data they're collecting that's really meant internally, to have a trusting partnership that can be shared publicly so people can respond and react to that as well. But it turns out that in most of our states, there actually is a lot of public data already shared, It's just not always clear to all of our partners where that exists, or it's not all brought into one place. And just by way of example, I started putting together a list, adding to some that already existed through ICI's website, but just as some existing sources of data that are publicly available, that reduce down to the state level, and sometimes even the more sub-local level, that might that already exists for your state that you might not be drawing upon, but could be helpful as you're thinking about setting your targets, monitoring your progress, and evaluating your efforts. There's state IDD agency surveys, American Community Survey, Rehabilitation Services Administration, RSA data, many of you are familiar with. Social Security Administration has data, and I'm going to show you some of these in just a minute. There's lots of state level demographic data, and on and on. I don't want to read through all these. These will be available in the slides along with links of where I could find them. Some of the data is not shared nationally, like your state performance reports, or you may even be in a state with an existing longitudinal data system or some sort of existing data system. Making sure you know about those data sources, have access to them, and are regularly making them part of your conversations might be your next step. So I'll just highlight a couple of sources. And again, this may be like familiar territory to everyone on this call, but for many people in our state, they just didn't know these existed. So some of you are familiar with the State of the State reports. Comes out of, I guess it's the Coleman Institute out in Colorado. The University of Colorado. And this is a report that comes out, you can purchase, but you can also go online and look at your state level data. It has trends in community living, public, private, residential institutions, family support. Those are certainly relevant to the lives of the people we're supporting, but particularly they have data on supported employment, and then also Medicaid waivers and supported living. There's also just general demographic data about the general population, personal income, total state budgets, those kinds of things. Survey of income and program participant data are all part of that set. And you can drop it down by your individual state or do a US profile on that. And that can be really, really helpful. Many of you are also familiar with the data that are compiled by the Institute for Community Inclusion that's specifically employment-related data. They pull together in this source IDD agency national survey of day and employment services data, data sets from Social Security Administration, state vocational rehabilitation program data, and then also some US Census American Community Survey data. And I just pulled up, you can see sort of the first page of what that looks like on the screen here for Tennessee, where there's obviously some overall employment or population and unemployment rate data, but then data that's coming from the American Community Survey for people with cognitive disabilities specifically. So the number of people who have a cognitive disability, number of people who are employed, who are unemployed, and goes on and on. One of the challenges, of course, of these public reports is aligning their definitions of disability with the focuses or the focus that you're wanting to have in your particular state. Those definitions often vary, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But that's a report that brings together a number of different data sources there as well. Others of you may be familiar with some of the state level data that you have that would be housed in Cornell University's disability statistics repertoire or clearinghouse rather. And that includes data from the American Community Survey, Community Population Survey, and a variety of other sources. And you can download state level reports there as well in both PDF and table format as well. So I've just put on the screen some of the employment-related outcomes that are included in this particular report. Overall employment outcomes, those who are not working but actively looking for work, annual earnings, annual household income, poverty status, SSI, education status, and health insurance coverage, all by disability and no disability as well. And then, of course, there's the fact finder data that comes from the US Census. And the websites for all of these are listed below. In some cases, And I haven't updated this to see if we have current data, but you're able to sometimes bring up employment-related data at the level not only of your whole state, but also of particular locales, counties, towns, cities. This is an older screenshot, but these are data for the county that I'm in right now, Nashville-Davidson County, where it breaks down employment for people with and without disability by sex and by age and employment status. And that can be really helpful if you're wanting to look at making the case for some of the needed changes at the level, at the local level or regional level as well. And then last that I'll highlight, and there's obviously more that you can look at, would be national core indicators data. Many of you are familiar with this. It's a collaborative effort between the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disabilities Services and also the Human Services Research Institute, and compiles data that comes from a consumer survey, a face-to-face conversation with a sample of at least 400 individuals 18 and older who have intellectual and developmental disabilities who are receiving at least one paid service from the state. And again, here you can look at that by state level data. And this is a list that I recently pulled of the states that are included in that data set, which include many of yours who are on this call as well. But there are a number of employment metrics in this, and I've put those on your screen as well. Whether the person does volunteer work, goes to a day program, estimates of hourly wage in community-based or facility-based jobs, numbers of community hours people are working, benefits, et cetera, all the way down. So it does give you a nice snapshot of a sample of individuals in your state that's already being collected perhaps, but the extent to which this is being well utilized by your project, I wouldn't know. We're also, I believe the states are able to add some of their own questions. There's a certain number of questions individuals can add, and we've done just that in Tennessee as well to get at some targeted things that we're particularly interested in here, that in learning about, that go beyond what's available in the common questions that spill across the states. So, that gives you just a snapshot of some of the sources. And here's how, I'm just putting up now, I'll just, again, won't perseverate on the graphs that I'm putting up because those aren't the important things, but just to show you how you can sort of drill down to where your state is relative to national trends, relative to other states, and relative to your own state over time. This is just always to me a graph that shows how much the work we're doing in our states, how important that is, because it puts total adults who are served in IDD agencies up against the number of adults in integrated employment. And you start to see that we've sort of stalled in many ways over the last decade. I don't have the most recent data in here, and actually slipped or fallen behind when you look at the total number of individuals served. But for us in Tennessee, it allows us to say, how are we doing in terms of our outcomes for a given year relative to other states around the country, particularly states that really resemble ours a lot in culture and size and service delivery. So this is just a state-by-state breakdown of percentages of individuals in integrated employment from Hawaii all the way to Washington. And I think that just helps us anchor in some ways, what kind of changes would be reasonable to expect given what's happening in other comparable states. You start to see where states cluster and what would be a reasonable a benchmark to set as a goal for our particular state as well. Also, some of these data sources allow you to take those data over time and replot them so you can see trends in how your state is mapping onto trends nationally. And this becomes really important to have some anchor to historical trends because obviously we were in a place early on with the recession and other economic issues going on that we've been recovering from. And so wanting to know how our state is doing relative to how the rest of the country is doing becomes a really important benchmark. This also allows us to look at where we were in 2012 when we began this project up through the most recently available data, which isn't on this screen, but is beyond 2014. And how does that map onto national trends as well? Allows us to look at overall numbers of individuals with disabilities, in this case, cognitive disabilities, again, over time, and we could compare that to national and other averages. But sometimes getting the numbers is particularly helpful, and we've often struggled as a state to move discussions of what does it look like to move from employing 19% of individuals to employing 25% of individuals. Those percentages are difficult to wrap our minds around sometimes, but being able to say, listen, we're at employing right now 44,000 people are employed. What would it take for us to increase the number of jobs by 2,000 or 3,000 people? What might that look like? And it helps it bring it down in many ways to a more manageable framework for thinking about this. You're also able, with many of these data sources, to not only anchor your data to national trends, but also to look at trends in your own state for people who do not have disabilities. And again, that becomes another valuable point of reference. So it would probably be unrealistic for us to move from 18% up to 70 plus or to 100% employment, because in our state, our overall rates don't exceed 3/4 employment rates for individuals without disabilities. So it helps us, again, appropriately frame what our benchmarks might be. I'm going to just put these up long enough so if you want to go back into the recording, you can find them. But total earnings from work for people with cognitive disabilities. Let me make a comment here. These are coming from Administration on Community, the American Community Survey data, where cognitive disabilities is defined differently than intellectual and developmental disabilities. So within that survey, a cognitive impairment basically means answering yes to the question, do you have a physical, mental, or emotional problem, or have difficulty remembering, concentrating, or making decisions. So it doesn't map on perfectly to intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that's been a struggle for our state, is that no existing data source maps perfectly on that because adult services use different definitions from school services, and then one agency may use different definitions from the other. So at the end of all this, while they give you glimpses into what the overall outcomes are and where your landscape is now, they don't perfectly depict that well because none of them map on perfectly. So anyway, weekly hours worked, percent of people below the poverty level for people with disabilities, without disabilities, and nationally. Data related to vocational rehabilitation in our state in terms of closures with an intellectual disability and all closures combined by number. Those trends over time just for intellectual disability, weekly earnings, etc. Two data sources that I think are important for a lot of your, probably a lot of your states as well, would be, if you're working with a focus on transition age youth, becomes 2 of the 4 transition-related indicators that give insight on the degree to which young people with disabilities are being prepared well and ultimately attaining their post-school outcomes in those early years after high school. So those would be indicator 13 data. And the definition is there on your screen for those of you who are not working in educational circles. But essentially the percentage of people who have a strong transition plan. And these are data for Tennessee that we have from back in 2006 all the way to present. And I'm not remembering offhand the reason for our little gap there in the last year, but that's back up to closer to 100%. That's a compliance indicator, not really a best practices indicator. And then, of course, indicator 14, which is really a measure of the extent to 1 year after exiting high school, what is the percentage of people with disabilities who are employed, involved in post-secondary education, or a combination of the 2 of those. And so we're able to plot out those trends for our state and say, well, given where we are now and where we want to be, what makes sense for next year's goal and the following year goal? Can we set some anticipated goals based on our past trends and the work that we know we're doing right now? For us, we can break these data down by a disability type, those who have intellectual disabilities versus autism versus emotional behavioral disabilities. I'm not sure the extent to which your state makes those breakdowns available. So lots of data sources in a sense. I'm really interested in obviously in other issues beyond employment. So it also exists for inclusive schooling, which can be a predictor of post-school employment outcomes and college attainment. So we look actually at our inclusive schooling data. And we're also, of course, interested in some of our residential outcomes as we make changes alongside employment to helping people live well and live fully in their community. So those data sources are all out there. For us, then it becomes, as a project, at the level of each of our agencies, can we have some conversations about the outcomes that we're setting for our agencies? Do we have data on our outcomes? If we don't, where can we get those? Are they already reported elsewhere? Do they need to be shared in more public ways? What data do we have on our current service delivery? How well are we able to speak to the services that we're providing? Because that becomes an important, obviously, point of change in our states, is changing ultimately practices. So what do we already know about our current practices? How are variations in our service delivery influencing our outcomes? In some cases, we are able to, if you have good data on the practices of agencies, look at how those may be co-varying with different outcomes of individuals being served. So, for example, if we know something about indicator 13 data and districts that have really strong transition planning, are we also seeing better post-school outcomes in those particular districts relative to others? And that might be an indication that some of the changes we're advocating in the area of high quality transition plans are actually materializing into better outcomes. We also encourage our agencies to think not only about the outcomes and service delivery and the interaction between the two of those, but what do they know about the satisfaction of key stakeholders with those outcomes and with their service delivery? And are they collecting any data on barriers and facilitators to delivering really exceptional services? So obviously some of these, like the outcomes, some of those show up in public ways. But bullets 2 through 5 sometimes are more internally held. And so asking agencies to reflect on what do we already collect, what do we feel comfortable sharing, and where do we not have data that speak to these things that we might need to begin pursuing a path to making sure those data are being collected as well. And then there may be other questions that you're interested in. But we've actually brought these questions out at some of our quarterly meetings where we reflect on what are we already collecting in each of these areas, what might we do better or differently or more of as well. The other thing that we've been doing as a partnership since about really second or third year, even now as we're now post-funding, is we continue to have these conversations about, given this portfolio of data in front of us, how do we go about setting agreed upon benchmarks for this partnership? How do we find employment-related percentages or numbers that we all can get behind and say, that's a reasonable but ambitious goal for our state? Is that going from 17% employment to 19% this next year or in 3 years? Or is it doubling it to 38%? What's reasonable? What do we feel like we can get behind? And what's the data we're drawing upon that tells us we're likely to attain that if we pursue it? In addition, we also ask, how do we integrate data and the data sharing into our ongoing discussions as a partnership? Sometimes at our partnership meetings, we highlight particular data where we are, talk about why it matters, and brainstorm what we could do to change or elevate those numbers. But that's an important discussion at your partnership level. You might also want to ask, what help or resources do we need to address our data-related needs well? Our particular state application included, obviously, the involvement of Vanderbilt University, which is how I'm part of this project as well. And so we are really, in many ways, the data analytic arm of the project. And we offer regularly to help agencies think about how they're collecting data, how they're looking at their data and analyzing it and presenting it back so that it's meaningful and actionable. And it's quite likely that in each of your states there are universities or faculty or other entities that bring that set of skills and a passion for this that could be helpful. We've also had some conversations along the way about, and this is really, it becomes an issue of trust and relationship building, but under what conditions do we feel comfortable sharing our own agency's individual data with other agencies? And we sensed really quickly there's a great vulnerability there about sharing those data. It helped when we pointed out some of the data is already shared. It's already nationally available. But in other cases, coming up with some guidelines for, as a partnership, what, in what context will that be presented? What can be shared from beyond that meeting? And what are the places where it's really for internal discussion and communication as well? So those are some of the discussion points that we draw upon as we've been thinking about this issue of data and guiding our projects. One of the things that became clear to us, I think in our first year, we may have even proposed this in our grant, is that it wasn't okay for data to remain hidden, that wasn't going to help our partnership or individual agencies at all. And so we endeavored to create a data dashboard. It's part of our Tennessee Works website. And the data that people did feel comfortable sharing, or data that was already publicly available but hard to find in all of those different resources, we spent the first year trying to combine it into a data dashboard that would be that the partners felt like would be helpful to their work, would create in many ways a public accountability for our progress, all those different things. So for us, it was, I'm going to actually put it up on your screen so you can see what it looks like. But our dashboard, the purpose was really to describe the Tennessee landscape on issues related to transition to adulthood and employment, to make accessible data that's really hard to interpret or to find, and then also reveal, I think, to the partnership, where do we have gaps? There's questions that we can't answer with the available data. So if you went to our website, I don't know if this will work, you click on by the numbers. It'll take a minute to load. That's our data dashboard, and it'll load up. I'll just scroll through this so you can kind of see a little bit about what's up there. Some of the national data you see there on employment. I'm going to come back to this, but these are data from some individual studies we've collected. You'll see data from our state agencies there, VR data on case closures. You'll see data from our longitudinal data system, and then there on the bottom, data that's pulled from the National Core Indicators report. That dashboard was created by our partnership. We did the technical work. It wasn't super difficult to do, but you can click on any of those to learn more. But we did a lot of vetting with them of what form could we put this in that it will be feel useful to you and will actually be drawn upon. And in fact, our partnership meeting is Friday, and we're revisiting this dashboard to figure out what needs to be updated, what needs to be added, and how could we continue to refine our sharing of data as well. So that's a bit about kind of what's already out there for our state, perhaps for your state. But for our reflection on what we were already collecting and reporting, we realized there was a lot that we weren't collecting good data on, a lot of things we needed to know about, but no individual agency was already collecting that, and we needed to do some original data collection. And so this has, I think, been really a hallmark of our project, and is where a partnership with your local USED or university or other data-minded organization could be particularly helpful. So we've carried out a number of might describe as side studies. Weren't all, of course, intended to be published, although that has been something that's been a priority of ours. If we're collecting it, doing the hard work of collecting in our state, let's also share what we learn nationally into the broader field. But I'll mention these, and I'll just highlight a few. We've done a series of studies around the community level attitudes and expectations and ideas related to improving employment outcomes. We call those community conversations. Those have actually involved about 1,500 people all across our state sharing their perspectives on their community, on the importance of employment, and their ideas on how employment outcomes might be changed at the local level. We've done a series of studies around parent expectations, where we have a pretty good sense now of how nearly 2,500 parents of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in our state think about employment and other post-school outcomes. And I'll share those data with you in a minute. We've done some studies about the professional development needs of educators and transition staff, and hopefully plan to do that around VR and other staff as well, to understand what are their training needs, what are their resource needs, what practices are they already implementing, and what would it look like or take to help them implement new and best practices in ways that aren't already permeating what they do. So those are some of the examples. We also have something not unique to our state, but not all states have a longitudinal data system that integrates data from labor and higher education and K-12 education that allows us to look at who's working with and without disabilities, who's in college with and without disabilities, and how those outcomes break down by each of the 13 IDEA disability categories. So that's a unique data source we didn't create, but was coming along online at the same time as our grant was, and we've been able to tap into that already existing data source to begin to answer some of our questions. We've also done some studies of employer expectations and school business partnerships as well. But I thought, some of you states I know are doing a community, are really thinking about community level implementation of state level advocated policies and practices. And we call those community conversations. So I thought I would maybe highlight some of the data we collect as part of these community conversations events to shape our resource development, our policy recommendations, as well as to spur some local changes in employment outcomes. And then you might have some questions about that as we go. But I wanted to highlight this. For us, you've got state level policies. You want to see changes in the focus and quality of those. You want to make sure changes in your regulations and in fiscal allocations are all changing. And then at the level of the student, we want to see that each individual student or a young person with a disability is accessing employment experiences. So you want to see outcomes changed at the level of each individual adult or transition age youth. But between these two levels of the state policy and the individual person with a disability is the community. And that's a really important place to collect data and learn from communities about how you might make local change that lies between this larger scale and individual level change. I can come back to that, but for us, this becomes really, really important. So we have strived as a project over our 5 years to find ways of hearing from and engaging and then raising the awareness of community members who are in the service system, but also those who are outside of the disability service system, who really are critical allies and advocates for employment. So this might mean business leaders, civic leaders, employers, community groups, congregations, families, finding some way to capture their perspectives and their input has been probably one of the most profound influences on our work as a state. So if you're not familiar with a community conversation, some of you I know are doing this. Kentucky, California, Illinois has done these, Wisconsin, others have talked about this. But these are essentially asset-based approaches for trying to engage a cross-section of diverse stakeholders in addressing an issue of importance in their local community. We style it after the World Cafe process. But the idea is that you bring together a group of 50 to 80 community members, at least half of whom have no connection to the disability service system, but who know their community inside out. And through a series of small and large group conversations over 2 hours, where they're thinking about the strengths and possibilities and needs of their local community, you begin to get a really good picture of local attitudes and local change possibilities. And then if you do these events across your state, all over your state, you start to pick up on themes in the attitudes and expectations and desired movements of local communities where you can start to tell a state level picture. And I think for us, the importance of this becomes that if you're going to make change around employment, you can't just focus on what schools do or agencies do or even what employers or families do. It takes their collective movements along with the community of employers and civic leaders and neighbors and coworkers and others to work in tandem to begin to change these outcomes. And we don't always have policies that focus on these natural community partners, so we have to figure out other ways of helping to raise their attitudes and expectations and their awareness and local opportunities as well. So we view these community conversation events not only as a way to build local awareness, which would kind of be an intervention, but also to understand how ordinary Tennesseans think about employment and think about their communities. So it's helpful in terms of understanding attitudes in your community, and but it's also helpful in generating ideas for systemic changes that need to happen, barriers at the policy level or funding level or service delivery system level that you start to hear in one community after the other, and you start to realize, wow, these are systemic issues that we ultimately have to address here. So this becomes really important. So in our case, we focus these around increasing meaningful employment opportunities for people with disabilities. But what I want to share is we've done these around a whole host of different applications and events. And what comes up from now the nearly probably 30 different events we've done around employment, we start to see these big needs emerging of themes around the need to develop local employment opportunities and some strategies to make that happen on the right side of the screen. The importance of launching community-wide awareness efforts and some strategies for doing that on the right. The critical need to strengthen school and transition services and some ways of doing that on the right. So this is just a summary of the themes that come up when we look across different communities that have hosted these one-time community level events. And you start to see really important patterns. And those themes become more evident when you look at sort of how many times strategies are generated in each of these core themes around these different areas of action. And for us, when we start to see the same thing emerging across from one event to the next, and we've labeled them A through F, but these are local communities with names, you start to see some of those kind of common needs as well. We also, at the end of our events, ask attendees about their perceptions of the event, but also of their community. And that also gives us a sense of the extent to which local communities feel like, you know, are employers receptive to hiring people with disabilities? Are there strong partnerships in their community between employers and agencies and families? And if not, that raises local needs around awareness, as well as some strategies to do more coordinated action at the local level. So for us, it also has been a way to look at whether local change happens as a result of these community events. So we follow up people who attend our community conversations 6 weeks later to ask about whether they've actually implemented any of the ideas that were shared at that local event. And what surprised us is that many people who came just to share their perspective actually ended up acting on some of the things that came up at that local event. But we wouldn't have known that unless we were intentional about collecting that data and following up with attendees or following up with communities as well. And I see a question there about whether themes are identified via qualitative analysis. And they are. The themes that emerge from the conversations we analyze qualitatively. And then, of course, the surveys that we do, we can analyze quantitatively. They're just Likert type scale surveys that we do. And then we can analyze those patterns by looking across events. So great question, Jennifer. So we're not the only state that has done this. Illinois, Wisconsin, California has as well. And we actually all kind of planned some data collection activities and writing around this as part of the last round of PI funding, which might be something that you all want to do. There'll be a special issue of the Journal of Disability Policy Studies that highlights this approach to community change, shows how you collect data, and then discusses the policy implications at our state level for how we did that. And that'll come out in the next issue, I think sometime here early in 2008. We can also, I'll put some links up a little bit later on the questions that we pose at these events. I see that question from Leanne. And all of actually the information you would need to put on a community conversation exists on our website. You can download everything that you would need at tennesseeworks.org/community conversations. The other thing that we've collected original data is around expectations of family members, educators, employers, and others. And again, no one was already collecting this, but this seems really critical because expectations ultimately predict outcomes. And if people aren't envisioning employment, they're not going to pursue it. And that's true whether you're a family member, whether you're a person with a disability, whether you're an educator or an agency representative. So we collaborated with our state IDD agency and actually 150 other organizations, local groups, congregations, school districts, and others to get a survey out to about 2,400, 2,500 parents of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we created a one-page infographic that shows what we learned from these families about their expectations for full and part-time employment. And their expectations are related to post-secondary education or life in the community. And then this document became something that we shared at our Disability Day on the Hill. It became a conversation starter with legislators, with other policy people to say, this is what families are wanting. And we could combine that with an analysis of IEP data to say that mirrors what young people are wanting themselves. They don't aspire to sheltered workshops or piece rate wages or day programs. They really want a life that involves employment. So as we analyze those data more closely, and we have an article on this you can read more about, it gives us a very nice portrait of what what kinds of outcomes parents place importance on, and how likely they think these outcomes are going to be for their sons and daughters. And in our state, like yours probably, we have a mixed portrait. Not every family is eager about employment in the community, whether part or full-time. Many do expect sheltered workshops to be the outcome, which drives us to think about how do we help these families catch a different vision for what's possible and desirable for their sons and daughters. Because so many families were still having trouble envisioning work in the community, that drove our efforts to create some success stories and family stories of videos of families who were talking about the impact that employment did have on their son or daughter with IDD. And you can see a link to where you can go watch those videos that came out of that need to be able to tell stories to change those numbers. The other thing we asked about in those particular surveys is what parents' views were on the important features of a particular job. And what was interesting in that to us was that their pursuit of employment wasn't around high rates of pay, high numbers of working hours per week, or opportunities for advancement. Those were actually the least prioritized elements of a job for their son or daughter. They wanted jobs that brought personal satisfaction, that were a good mix for their son or daughter, that provide interaction opportunities and friendship opportunities, and supports at a workplace that was committed to employing people with disabilities, which really highlighted for us the importance of thinking about person-centered planning in this process and really individually identifying jobs that were fits for people, which requires training for our agencies to do that kind of really nuanced, individualized work. We also asked about things like what are parents concerned about in terms of their employment. And I'm going to skip some of these for time, but just want you to know that they're in there and exist. And surveys like this could be replicated in your own state. We're glad to share our surveys with you, adapt them as you see fit to get a local portrait of what's important. We wanted to know to what extent are parents actually giving their sons and daughters experiences that might contribute to future employment. And we found that a lot of them weren't doing that. There wasn't a lot of conversations about future career goals. They didn't spend a lot of time helping their sons and daughters learn about career options or connecting them to community, volunteer, or extracurricular experiences, all important foundational experiences for future work. We took the findings that we had for this particular study, as we do for all of our studies, and before we published it in any journal that very few people read, we turned it into infographics that could be shared widely at a local and state level to make that information accessible and compelling to people in our state. So while we are telling stories in journals and in national venues, we also have to make sure we're telling it locally in ways that are accessible. One of the things that we also asked in that family survey was about just parents' familiarity with resources related to a whole host of issues, including employment. And it became very clear that very few families knew what services and supports were out there, and what could help them. And so out of these data, that drove us to create a portal on our state website that helped them figure out who is out there who could help my son or daughter. And for agencies and educators, who else is out there that could partner with us on a variety of issues. And so if you went to our Tennessee Works website now and you clicked on supports and partnership, it would end up taking you eventually to a web page where when you scroll down, you'll see agencies and organizations in our state, probably ones that also exist in your state, maybe with just different names. And you can go and select what area you're interested, click employment, and it'll sort them by those that do employment. And then for each of those agencies and organizations, pulls up a video about what they do, and then a downloadable brief, because families were saying, we don't know what this agency does. We don't know who's eligible. We don't know who they serve. We don't know what it costs. We don't know who to talk to. So we use those data to turn it into information that could be all pulled together in one place and would be accessible for these families. So again, the data is not for the sake of data. We steward it well, and then we act on it and try to be responsive as we go. We've also used findings from surveys of families to ask them, what kinds of things do you want to know more about? How helpful would different resources in different areas be? And we've used those data to prioritize the resources we develop. And if your state's like ours, what you'll find is people need lots of information. And so you can't do it all at once. So how do you begin to prioritize what you focus on and how you ultimately deliver it? And so we asked about in what ways you'd be most likely to access information. And as you'll see on here, it wasn't by going to a conference or even a workshop. They wanted it on demand and in accessible ways that came to them. And so that's what we prioritized. So that's why our website builds out a section for families, the things they said they needed and wanted to know. There's one place that they can go to learn that information as well. It also led us to launch a blog for families and others, which really is written by a parent who's part of our team, and helped make sure that information was coming out in timely ways as well. I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about how we've done a similar survey for educators, but it's the same logic. We've been really interested in knowing what educators are doing to prepare kids with disabilities for future employment. And we particularly are asking a lot of things around to what extent do they know how to do good transition assessment and transition planning. And so I've just got some slides in here you can come back to later if you're working with schools in particular that get at what educators are talking about recommendations for how they would like to receive professional development, how often it should happen, what they're doing in terms of transition assessment, what factors lead them to choose one assessment over the other. And then we use that data to create an assessment database on our website so that educators were basically telling us, we don't have access to training on transition assessment. We don't know how to assess employment skills. We don't know what tools are out there for us. And because that was a key issue that kept coming up all across the state, we made sure that part of our resource development on our website became a searchable database of transition and employment related assessments that anyone could search and find. And it looks like it's not coming up here, but you can search for employment-related assessments that are free, that are low cost, that focuses on young people's strengths, interests, preferences, and needs as well. Oh, here it is. I thought I had. So you go down to our online assessment database. You click on that. It'll end up pulling a database of now close to 100 different assessments. You can search those assessments by different domains. You can focus on, needs, strengths, interests, preferences, variety of different things that you're seeing kind of come up as we go. And then when you select one, say you want to know about employment related strengths, you click those things, hit search, and it filters those assessments to those that address that particular area. I share that, one, because we're really proud of it, but the other is that came from collecting data about what teachers' most pressing needs were. We would not have done that had we not actually talked with or studied this issue from the perspective of these teachers. And that's true of families. We would have been developing the wrong things if we hadn't collected those data. Last couple things, and please start queuing up questions that you have about things that I've addressed for the last segment. But we also collect data on our impact of our project, our dissemination efforts, the reach of our website, of our newsletter. So we have 85,000 users of our website. We track that and we can tell where in the state they're coming from. And we can also tell where in the state they're not coming from, and realize that some rural communities aren't using our website. And so we need other resources. We track our newsletter subscribers so we can see how that's breaking down into our stakeholder groups. We have 2,300 users of our Transition Tennessee web-based training site. So that helps us be able to speak to the reach of our efforts to equip practitioners in this area. And we look at the reach of our social media efforts and awareness campaigns. Our October Hire My Strengths campaign reached 50,000 social media users' accounts. And so that we want to know that. If we're not reaching anyone, it's not worth pouring our efforts and time into that. So a lot of data there that could be drawn upon by your different project. For us, those data are shared at each quarterly partnership meeting. Not all of it, but usually some element of it makes its way into our presentation. And we use that as a way of helping people think about, what does this data mean to us? How can we move to change those particular outcomes? We also embed the data we collect already and the new data that we collect originally into our annual reports that go to our governor. And I've put on the screen our only four, the four expect employment reports we've done, and the link you can download these. But if you open them up, you're going to see on the different pages, I've pulled snapshots of how the data we're collecting are making it way into those very public reports. Data on wages, on employment outcomes, on types of jobs, and all of those come from the data sources that I already have shared with you as well. We also bring that information to our Disability Day on the Hill and fact sheets and infographics. And that really positions individual families to say, hey, listen to my story as a family navigating all this. And guess what? My story is not the only story. There are thousands of stories like mine of people who want employment but are struggling to find the supports and opportunities to make that happen. And so this equips them to do just that. We also, in those reports, if you look in our strategic plan, you'll see lots of, we have our overall goals and then objectives and strategies under each of them. And these are some of the ones we're working on now, but you'll see each of these required data to be able to answer. So we've also embedded accountability for data collection and data sharing into our strategic plan, and people have now come to expect it. So again, just to wrap up and taking you back to those questions, these are some of the partnership level questions that we've been asking at Tennessee. What can we point to that makes sure that can tell us we're making progress? What are our goals moving forward? And do we have numbers or descriptors we can attach to them? How well are we as a state drawing upon the data that's already exists? Are we capitalizing it, or are we just collecting it and burying it? What data do we need to collect to answer our most pressing questions? What are we not collecting that we should be? And for us, what data do we need to be collecting not only to inform our movements, but also to make the case for more financial investment, sustainability, and even future grants? And we're not relying on future grants, but we certainly want to pursue them. And the better data we have that shows our progress and where we are now, the more compelling that those applications will be. So a little bit over my time, but we still have about 20, 25 minutes for your questions and reactions and comments. I think, we're really happy. Data's not quite a 4-letter word anymore in our state. It still elicits some groans, but I think the value is seen better. And I think we're excited about our efforts to continue to dive deeper in this particular area. So I'm going to stop there and see what questions you have. Don, you want to open up the phones or open up chat?
As I said at the beginning, I'm marking you all as available to use your microphones to participate. So if you want to just ask your question, you can do that. If you don't have a microphone on your computer or you're having some technical difficulty, you can type them in the chat box. And Professor Carter will read them for everyone to hear.
We'll use that very awkward wait time where I just stare at you until you feel compelled to ask questions. I do know while people are queuing up, we're thinking some of the states on the call are already doing some of the things that we're doing. And so it'd be great to hear if you're doing similar things or doing them in slightly different ways. That would be a value to hear as well.
And if you go to pose a question and you don't hear yourself in the stream, your microphone is muted. You roll your mouse over the screen. You can, at the lower left-hand corner, is the microphone button, and you can unmute yourself.
We have gotten some questions from states about can we take the survey you did with families? Can you send us the ways you recruited for that or the actual survey? We're glad to do that. Folks who are wanting to see the structure for these community conversations or how data is collected and the findings from individual events, we're glad to share that as well. We would really love if other states took some of these approaches and made them better and did them differently. Would love to support that.
We don't need to only ask questions. We've got 20 minutes, so we can have a bit of people have some thoughts beyond questions.
I never thought of systems change projects as a shy group.
Eric, it's David Hoff. I have a question. I've always been curious about the community conversations and about the amount of time and energy that had to go into organizing them, because they get touted a lot as a great concept, but I can't imagine the level of energy and resources that must go into putting them together.
Yeah, it's good. Great question, David. It's in our case, see Kentucky's on there doing them as well. I think the amount of time that it's taken us to do them has decreased over the years. Early in our project, we were the ones really organizing them and recruiting. And that was very time consuming for us as a project, and we didn't have resources allocated much to that. We've since shifted away from that, where we invite communities to identify some local leaders who will do that on. We train a couple people from that team then to put on their own event. And the time that's required is us going to the event itself and taking the data back. So we don't host really occasionally, but generally we're not the ones hosting them anymore. Local communities are, which is the way it ought to be. That's the way the local change is going to happen. The analyses can take a lot of time, or it can be relatively simple. We probably overanalyze. We spent more time analyzing our data because we were wanting to publish it in these broader journals, but to have the actionable data that we would have needed as a project would have been less than that. In other words, we wouldn't have to do as rigorous a qualitative analysis to be able to pick up on the themes we needed to move forward as a state project. But we took it a little further because we also had a secondary audience in mind. But to be able to have, sample of 1,500, 2,000 perspectives of 2,000 or so people, actually it's well more than that when you take into the different topics we've done from nearly 30 different communities across the state. That's I think collectively far less time than it would have taken us to do the design work on the surveys and get those sent out and the sampling issues that come with that. So it's not the most efficient way, but it's not as time consuming as you might think. And I would also add, there's usually good food at a community conversation. So from all the data collection efforts that I make, it's probably the best because you get fed with good chocolate and coffee. Jeff, I see you. So I don't want to put, but you all have been doing a few of these community conversations. You want to add anything to what his question was about the
well,
value?
yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, our perspective, I think, is a little different with the new kids on the block. But what we've really been trying to concentrate on is getting some kind of action out of the areas. You know, what we don't want to do is we don't want to spend a great deal of time coming up with a lot of great ideas, and then the great ideas just kind of wither away.
Yeah.
So we've been more involved after the fact with the community conversation localities, trying to come up with projects that are of local interest. And we've had some success with that, and we're moving forward with those. Over time, I would hope that we might have a selection of potential projects that folks might be interested in to move forward with. Yeah. But it can be very time-consuming. But also, it's also, I think, very enlightening, and the relationships that we're building, I think, are going to pay big dividends in the future.
And that's a good point. If your goal of your event is simply to hear from participants and learn about local issues and possibilities, that's a different level of time than if your goal is then to also make sure that gets channeled into local change, which requires a follow-up team and some kind of coaching and accountability to keep that going. I don't have a firm number on this, but my hunch is about 2/3 of the communities that we do a community conversation and actually move on some of the ideas that they shared, and about 1/3 of them, not much comes from it. It was a lot of good ideas that certainly inform the larger project, but there's an added component if your goal is intervention in that community. That does require more time, for sure. I will add another value of that. It got a lot of us, we're in a long state, 8 hours long. And so it got a lot of partner members out into communities they hadn't been in, and it gave the local community a face of this larger movement that they might have been skeptical of what's coming out of Nashville or out of the capital, but it put the project in relationship with local communities, and that can be a value as well. I heard a little bit of that in what Jeff was saying. So I don't know the best way to send the surveys out, but probably send them to the Yes Center, and they can figure out how to distribute those. You can certainly email me, but if everyone wants those, I'd rather just send them to Yes, and you guys can forward them out.
Yeah, we'll be happy to upload them onto our website and let everybody know how to find them and how to access them, Eric.
I think the one comment I would make, Eric, is that you guys have been really busy. I mean, very, very busy, and the quality of the work that you have created is just phenomenal.
Well, I appreciate that. The phenomenal part, not the busy part. But you know what? Here's the thing. Our partnership, our dollars didn't go to lots of different, it wasn't spread really, really wide. But what we did well, which is, I'm speaking a little bit to me, is we tapped in, around the data collection, that's probably not everyone's sweet spot on your different projects. That seems like an add-on, a distraction, something like that maybe. Hopefully I've made the case that there's value in that. But if you can partner with some people who are incentivized to do that data collection, it furthers their own goals and needs as well. That's where you kind of get sort of free labor in all of this. So I did work on this project well beyond what my small portion was funded, because as a researcher, these are pressing questions I want to answer. And so we had other faculty, graduate students, doctoral students who gave of their time because it was helping them with their theses or dissertations or getting research or other kinds of experience. So that's why I'll go back to what I shared earlier. The more you can figure out who in your state would be incentivized, would be motivated, and this would meet a need they have that you wouldn't have to pay necessarily or spend much on, that's a way to get a lot more work done and leverage the resources that you have. I don't think we would have done this if this wasn't the university was a partner in this. I don't think that the partnership would have invested the dollars or time in it. And so that's what I would say is figure out who in your state gets really, really excited about that, or figure out who in another state would love, I love the community conversation piece. I'm really eager if folks are doing that to help you with data analysis or design of that, because that helps me scratch my itch to understand better how these get applied and what you can learn from them. And I bet there's other people around the country in different areas that you're working who would love to know family perspectives on a particular issue. And if you could help get a state sample, they would design that for you and do that analysis and on through whatever your goals might be. In terms of website resource design, the best thing you can do is find a 17-year-old and buy them a few cases of Mountain Dew and some Cheetos, and you can get a really cool website or social media stuff in like 24 hours. So that has nothing to do with data. It's just an unsolicited. Yeah. I'm just going to fill some time with more data stuff I didn't share unless I'm hearing questions. But some of you may be in states where the National Deaf Center on Post-Secondary Outcomes is hosting community conversations that are all done in sign and other forms of interpreting. So that's another example of sort of large projects, systems change kinds of things that are taking this approach, adapting it. So I share that because they're also planning another, 20 or 30 community conversations in states all around the country. And if they haven't done one in your state, they may be planning to do one. And that would be a chance for you to go see what an event looks like and then see whether it's a fit for your particular needs in your state as well. I know they've done them recently in Wisconsin, Washington State, Hawaii, Texas. I can't remember the others. Donald, Ruthie, is there anything else you're expecting or hoping I might cover?
I think this has been amazing, and your PowerPoints have a tremendous wealth of information and examples of how what you've gathered and how you've presented it, both from an academic as well as a real people, user end. And I really, really appreciate it. I think we've got a lot to digest. One of the things, and I want to thank everyone who's been signed on to this particular webinar. As Donald indicated, it is being recorded, so we will be able to share this also on the YES website, so people can go back through and take your slides and the things that you presented at a little bit slower bites of information. It's amazing. It's just really, really helpful, Eric, and drawing from all the different data sources, I think will help us really look at the aggregate for all the states I know the Lewin Group is doing their own set of evaluation measures, but for us, really to see, you know, the aggregate progress that all of the states that we're supporting are making is really important to our outcomes and making sure we're giving everyone the best possible technical assistance. With that in mind, if anyone that is on this call today, or you have a colleague who wasn't able to participate, is interested in just forming a small, I don't want to call it necessarily a community of practice, but just a small work group around formulating data gathering strategies for your respective states and sharing out what you're doing, who you talk to, where you get things, how you're presenting it, possible templates for infographics. Send Allie an email because we would be very happy to set that up. This is a critical component of demonstrating to ACL that we are really making best use of our taxpayer dollars. And I know in this particular political climate, it's very, very important that we continue to show that this investment that ACL is making is having an impact in the lives of people with disabilities and their families. They use this in the stories that we gather, all the types of information that Eric presented, they use and they ask us for regularly to be able to say, you know, we need to tell our new secretary, we need to tell Congressman so-and-so, you know, what we're doing. And this really gives them evidence that the evidence-based practices we are aware of are being used and are really impacting people's lives. So if you're interested in forming a small, whether it's 2 people or 20 people, if you're interested in forming a small group to continue this conversation, just send Allie an email and we'll set up a time when we can begin to have, you know, just some ongoing, maybe monthly or semi-monthly times to say, what are we gathering? Where did that come from? And give ourselves some time to digest the PowerPoints and the information that Eric shared, and then be able to look at, this is something that we would like to continue this conversation. So thank you, Eric. I'm delighted.
Let me add 2 quick things and they're closing out. One is I appreciate your comment about the volume of stuff we have. Just to remind people, we're at the back end. We're after our project's done. But 1.5 years, 2 years in, these things were only beginning to emerge. So that's important. And the other is, you know, you talked about real researchers and real people as if they're 2 different groups. Sometimes they are. But get a subscription to PictoChart or something like that, a basic infographic thing, and start really small of just taking data you already have, repackaging it, sharing it at some of your meetings, dedicating a little time, and you'll start to see people get excited about it and start asking for more. But don't get a researcher like me in front of the group and have them share all these. Just yeah.
So you could wear your real person hat, Eric. We can still have you in front of the group. We'll just have your real person hat.
My real person hat. Okay. All right. Well, glad to be with you all, and again, if that group forms, glad to be part of that and share our ideas.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And then if there are any follow-up questions that you have that you just were a little reticent to ask today, you know, shoot those to Allie as well, and she might compile a little document, a Q&A that Eric, if you're willing to respond to those, that will give people a chance to, you know, kind of think through a little bit more, and we'll put together a Q&A as well as a follow-up. Thank you, everyone. On behalf of the center, we look forward to hearing again from another group of people doing work in Tennessee as they've wrapped up their final year. Our next webinar is going to focus on the employer roundtable that has actually been operating in Tennessee for over the course of time that really predates the Tennessee Works Project, but really was an instrumental component in the Tennessee Works Project, is really being able to look at and focus on employer engagement from an employer perspective. And so we'll be looking forward to giving you more details about that webinar and putting it into the S Center Bulletin. And we will have people from other states besides Tennessee, but you know, this is the first 2 that we've been able to really pull together, and we're delighted to have their support and their willingness to help fellow states in this journey towards employment first for all. So thank you, everyone. And goodbye. And Happy New Year.